Hey everybody, Kuru Paul here. In today's video, exclusively for Kuru crew members, I'm actually going to be talking about a post from one of the Kuru crew members, from Mark here. Said, trying to figure out if there's a best way to read a Spanish article or story and maximize learning. I find myself reading the Spanish but immediately translating to English. Although I understand what I'm reading, I don't feel like I'm picking up or absorbing the language itself. Should I spend more time actually pronouncing the words in Spanish out loud? How do you read? What has given you the most success? It's actually a fantastic question. One of my recommendations is when someone's learning Spanish is to actually read in Spanish as much as possible. And I don't mean just reading what's on your phone or simple websites, but actually getting something like a novel that's in Spanish. It could be originally written in Spanish or it could be a translation. It really doesn't matter. But it will really push you. And I also recommend reading it just before you go to bed. That's a big thing too. I found it helps me. But I understand exactly what he's saying, where you find yourself, translating to English and kind of moving through it. There is a temptation to do that. So I'm going to show you how I would use a book in Spanish to really learn the constructions. The book I'm going to be using is one that I'm actually reading right now. It's by Jon Katzenbach. He writes in English and it's a translation into Spanish. He's very popular in Latin America, so you're going to find his books around there. This one is called Confianza Ciega, it's translated obviously, which is blind confidence. And I'm not reading it to get better at Spanish. I'm just reading it because I prefer to read in Spanish than in English. I don't know why, I just do. So I'm just going to take one page out of this thing. I just chose like page 9. And when you're more of a beginner or even early intermediate and you're reading a novel like this to try to get better at Spanish, don't get frustrated if you're not flying through this thing. You didn't sit down there and you're like, oh, I'm going to knock out 2 chapters before I fall asleep tonight. If you're doing that, you're skimming or you're not understanding the concepts or you're not getting the constructions or you're a genius. You could be any one of those things. So if you're a beginner, even if you're like, I'm going to take 1 page out of this or 2 pages, but I'm really going to focus on what I'm looking at. So we're taking page 9, okay? And I'm going to pop it up here on the screen and we're going to go through it. This is the top of page 9. We're finishing a sentence here on top with Pequeño municipio del estado de Nueva York, the small municipality of the state of New York. That wasn't too hard, right? Here's our next one. Right away, there's something that might make people go, all right, this is unusual. Fue un hueso duro de roer. Fue un hueso duro de roer. It was a tough bone to, and roer is not something you're going to use a lot. It's like what mice do, like to gnaw. So a tough bone to gnaw. This is the kind of thing that when you translate literally, you're thinking, all right, this is probably an idiomatic expression, right? And if you want to check that, just type it in Google that way. Fue un hueso duro de roer, and boom, it is. It's an idiomatic expression. And it just means something difficult to do, like it's a tough pill to swallow, would be an English equivalent. But you're like, okay, so I've just learned this idiomatic expression. Do I think it's useful? Do I think it's useful? Not really, but maybe if I see it again, I'm going to recognize it. Al final, bingo. Al final, at the end. Now, if you didn't know that, you might be like, okay, that might be useful. I kind of see how that sentence is structured. We go down. Una pausa. Como si el cliente estuviera pensando. If you've been watching my videos, you've probably heard me talk about como si. It is a construction that will trigger the imperfect subjunctive when you're saying like, as if something. And that's exactly what we have here. Como si el cliente, as if the client estuviera pensando, were thinking. Now, if you're new to Spanish, you might be like, okay, that sentence was not really making sense. I might have had to plug it in my translator. But if you had seen a video that I had done on that, and maybe you started to get it, but you didn't remember it, something like this is going to trigger that. You'll be like, como si, oh yeah, I saw Paul's video on that. Como si is going to trigger the imperfect subjunctive. Oh, and there it is. It's reinforcing that in your head. Excelente. Y en cuanto a la discreción, do you see it there? En cuanto a. One of my favorite sentence starters has popped right in there, and it doesn't have to be a sentence starter. En cuanto a, those 3 words mean regarding or in reference to. Excellent. And regarding discretion, la discreción. And so you might be wondering, why is it la discreción and not just discreción for discretion? And maybe you'll research that because you're paying attention to the particular construction. Well, the advantage you have right now is that I'm walking you through this page, so I'm just going to give you the answer. The reason it's la discreción, the discretion, is because in Spanish, the definite article is often used when you're talking about the overall concept of something, the whole of it. I'm talking about discretion as a whole, as a thing, la discreción. It's like if I talked about Catholicism, I would be like, el catolicismo. It's the whole. That's why that's there. So we go ahead and drop down a line. No conservo registros de quien me contrata. And literally translating that out would be like, I don't conserve or keep any type of, registrations or records of who hires me. Two things I would get out of that being new. I would pay attention right there, no conservo, to think, okay, I'm not keeping something, and Spanish is using the verb conservar. They're not conserving it. Little note there. Might notice that pattern again. The next thing I would notice is right there at the end, contratar. And I might look that up and see that contratar means to hire someone, to contract them, if that helps you remember. And I'll be like, oh, hiring somebody, that's a useful verb. Contratar would probably make my word list. Are you starting to see how I would actually go through this and kind of break it down? And again, it doesn't help the story flow in any way. I mean, it's kind of a laborious way to do it, but that's why I may only get through one page before I went to sleep. But then I'd be like, I've covered a lot of different things and they're fresh in my mind. And then I'd go to sleep and I'd wake up and a lot of them are still there and it's kind of solidified as I slept. I don't know, I'm dreaming about other things, but in the back of my hard drive, little processor's just going all night long. And then later I'm like, hey, contratar means to hire. Hey, conservar is how sometimes people say to keep something, right? To conserve it. Those things are going on in there. And we move on from there. Mintió el detective, pero solo un poco. Guardaba archivos encriptados de todos sus casos. Just want to draw your attention there to guardaba archivos encriptados. Guardar. That's a way to also say to store something or keep. So we've got conservar and guardar. Both really good verbs for that. I know at this point of the video, some of you are like, okay, is Paul really going to do this? He's going to go this slowly and methodically through this page? Yeah, I am. And the reason is because this is exactly what I would do when I was newer. I was probably high beginner, right getting into intermediate, and this is what I would do before going to bed. Not all the time, but a lot, several days a week. And it really pushed me out of my comfort zone. And I attribute a lot of my success to doing this on a regular basis. So here's our next line. El detective no sabía si el cliente había creído su mentira o no. The detective didn't know if the client had believed his lie or not. One thing there that I didn't comment before is detective. Comes right from English, should be super easy to remember, just have to change the way you pronounce it. Next part that I would notice is no sabía, didn't know. I notice it's in the imperfect. If you saw my video on the preterite imperfect, and you can see it in the deep dive series under the classroom section, I talk about that. And when we're talking about things in the past and people not knowing something or knowing something, the imperfect is going to be your go-to default because the preterite is often translated as to find out. Like, ¿cuándo supiste que Juan no vive ahí? When did you find out that Juan doesn't live there? But in a sentence like this, sabía is going to be your go-to. What do we get next? If the client had believed, había creído, I don't know if you have any trouble with that, su mentira, his lie, o no. Sometimes not gives people trouble. They're like, okay, how would I say his lie, had believed his lie or not? They're thinking not. Is there something special in Spanish for not? No, it's just no. Our next one, pero añadió con avidez. But added with, avidez is like avarice, greed. That is not particularly useful. That wouldn't even have made my word list. But the verb there, añadir, means to add is super useful. I use that in a lot of different things that would make my word list. Maybe not the first time I saw it, but it is common enough in Spanish, it would eventually make it. Now this next line is really interesting. Quiero que esté totalmente satisfecho con mis servicios. What do we see there? For you folks who have been learning the subjunctive, I know you see something right away because you see a classic subjunctive trigger here. We have querer, que. What does that trigger? The subjunctive every single time. And here we have that, right? Quiero que esté. Esté is in the present subjunctive. Totalmente, totally. And I haven't talked about it in here. I don't know if you've gotten that, but the mente in Spanish is the equivalent of the ly, li, in English. So total is total, totalmente, totally. Just a neat cognate trick. Satisfecho con mis servicios. Satisfied with my services. One thing I would notice there is that obviously the subjunctive trigger, if I was learning that, I'd be like, this is just reinforcing what I've learned. But also, estar with satisfecho, to be satisfied con, with something. I would take that as a separate phrase and put it on my word list. Estar satisfecho or satisfecha, right? For females, that's an adjective, so it's going to have to agree in number and gender with the subject. Con, with something. So I could be like, okay, estoy satisfecho con el servicio. I'm satisfied with the service. That's useful to me. Lo que el detective privado no dijo en voz alta fue, ¿es usted rico y quiero trabajar otra vez para usted porque el dinero me va muy bien? What I get right here is right up in front in the beginning there, lo que. I've talked about lo que all the time. This is super important in Spanish. It is everywhere in Spanish. And you think of lo que like the thing that, but a lot of times it's going to replace what in English when it's the what that's not a question. So what this is really saying is what the private detective didn't say in voz alta, like out loud, was that kind of what is going to be lo que. I don't know if you caught the useful expression here. I mentioned it just a second ago. En voz alta. Out loud. Okay? Super useful. That's one of those little 3-word, little snippets that you're just going to put on your word list that, you'll pop in later, like train cars, into your sentences. Es usted rico. You're rich. Y quiero trabajar otra vez para usted. And I want to work for you again. One thing there is trabajar para someone, to work for someone. Sometimes people have trouble determining if it's por or para. Trabajar para. Porque el dinero me va muy bien. Because the money goes very well to me, right? I like the money. Lo estoy. Like, I am, meaning I am satisfied with your services, and there's a lo right up there in front. That's the part that's referring to being satisfied. And this use of lo may be confusing for folks. I have a video dedicated to this, using lo in this type of circumstances to represent an adjective. Look what we have here next. En cuanto a sus honorarios. En cuanto a. What does that mean in reference to? This is the second time we've seen it on the same page. So if you had to look it up the first time and you're like, okay, it means reference to or regarding, now I'm already seeing it again. And you're probably going to see it again and again and again. And this is how it's reinforcing the vocabulary. Sus honorarios. Honorarios are like, I'm trying to think what the best word in English would be. You pay honorarios to like lawyers, it's like their fee. I would say, that would be their fee. Supongo que aceptará efectivo. I suppose that you will accept cash. Supongo comes from suponer, and a lot of times it's going to be right before que, like I suppose that. I think that's useful. Anything that I could use as a sentence starter to kind of slow down the conversation is going to make my word list, and that's definitely one of them. Because it's like saying, creo que, I believe that, or I think that, or supongo que, and I got a second to think before I plug something in. Definitely makes the list. Gracias. Si hay algo más o si necesita cualquier otro trabajo de investigación en el futuro, si hay algo más. Hay, what a great word in Spanish. Hay, the H-A-Y, means is there or are there is or there are, depending if it's a question. Si hay algo más, if there's anything else. O si necesita cualquier otro trabajo de investigación en el futuro, or if you need any other investigative job in the future. The other person kind of jumps in there. Será el primero a quien llamaré. You'll be the first one that I call. The thing that would probably interest me there would be the el primero a quien llamaré, is remembering that little personal a before quien, to show that that's the object of the sentence. Like, you'll be the first to whom I call. That might have been something I go, and then moved on. Se lo prometo. Se lo prometo. I promise you. That is a classic Spanish line. Those three words, se lo prometo. I promise you. And that's going to be when you're speaking to somebody in the usted form. Otherwise it would be te lo prometo. Te lo prometo. Eso era exactamente lo que el detective privado quería oír. That was exactly what the private detective wanted to hear. What do we see right in the middle of that sentence? Lo que. And in the English, I said, that's exactly what the private detective wanted to hear. Fantástico. Fantastic. That is a useful word. Se lo agradezco. I thank you. Now, it's really like saying, like, the lo in there is like, I thank you for it, whatever it was. And if you want to speak in the informal, the to form, you're just going to change that se to a te. Te lo agradezco. Te lo agradezco. One way to force yourself to really slow down and do this is to read this out loud, to go slowly and actually pronounce the words. It's going to keep you from just kind of skipping words, visually. Oh, I'm done with that page. Really sound it out. Now, this isn't always possible. For example, I said I used to do this a lot just before I went to bed. I was actually in bed, I'd read, and I would occasionally sound out a word, and my wife would be like, stop it. So it's not always possible. Y creo que si la información resulta ser tan exacta como dice, and I believe that, or I think that, if the information, and I like this part here, resulta ser. This is super useful in Spanish. You'll have like resulta ser, turns out to be, results to be, which results to be doesn't sound like good English. Turns out to be. Super useful. Just to kind of take that little snippet and put it over here because it's easy to pop that one into sentences. Tan exacta como dice. As exact as you say. This is another thing, the tan como pairing, they work well together. You may not have gotten that just from that though. Recibirá una considerable recompensa más adelante. You will receive a considerable compensation más adelante, in the future, down the road. Más adelante. Pero tendrá que darme algo de tiempo. But you'll have to give me something of time, like a little bit of time, algo de tiempo, para que pueda asesorarme. Para que, in order that, or so, right? That is a classic subjunctive trigger. We know the subjunctive is going to follow, and there it is, pueda. That comes from poder, and it's in the subjunctive. Our verb there are cerciorarme. I don't like it. It's not something I would say. It's like to make sure of something. There's other ways to say it. That would make my list. If it doesn't roll off my tongue really easily, it's not making the list. Un par de meses, diría yo. A couple of months, I would say. See, diría is in the conditional. Esto también hizo feliz al detective privado. That also made the private detective happy. Now, this construction is the way this is kind of going, would make me pause. I'm like, okay, esto también. So this also, that's pretty easy. But this part, hizo feliz al detective privado. You notice in English we're like, makes the private detective happy. The happy part is way at the end. But in Spanish, this is literally saying, this also makes happy the private detective. And that word order is unusual, so I'm going to pay attention to that. Empezó a calcular mentalmente. He began to calculate mentally, right? We have that ly, mentalmente. Lo grande que sería la recompensa. Now this is another interesting use of lo, and lo is a very diverse word in Spanish. But this using lo with an adjective to mean like how something. Lo grande, how big, que sería, like would be la recompensa, the compensation for this, right? Like the reward. Es un detalle por su parte. Me gusta ser generoso. I like to be generous. Don't worry, folks, we're almost done. I know this is a little bit dry, but you know what? You're learning things. So we're going to drop down to our last little paragraph here. La información resultó ser exacta. What do we have right in there? We just talked about how common it is to use like resultar ser, like or resulta ser, this one's in the past tense, to turn out to be. We're already seeing it again in the same page. Y la recompensa fue realmente considerable. And the reward was really considerable. Llegó 3 meses después. It arrived 3 months later. El detective privado había estado solo hasta bien entrada la noche en su pequeño despacho situado en un centro comercial, trabajando en un caso de divorcio trivial, pero particularmente desagradable. That is a long sentence, folks. We kind of break this down. The private detective had been alone until had entered the night in his small office situated. So we have su pequeño despacho situado. I like that. You like to say where things are located. Situado, it has to agree a number and gender, it's an adjective, is really useful. So if it was oficina, it would be situada and wherever it's located. That's a useful one. So here we have it's situado en un centro comercial. Un centro comercial is like a commercial center. You know, sometimes they also use that for the mall, but it can just be a commercial center. Trabajando en un caso, working on a case de divorcio trivial, of trivial divorce, pero particularmente, but particularly desagradable, like unpleasant. Desagradable is a really good word for your word list. And then we have los dos miembros de una pareja acomodada. The two members of a, and that word might have stood out for you, acomodada. That can be like well off, you know. They're a well-to-do couple. Los dos miembros de una pareja acomodada que se había prometido en... And then we go on to page 10, folks, which I'm going to spare you from that one. But this is how I would break it down and really pay attention to the constructions. Now look how long that took. Especially if I'd had a hard day at work or something like that, and I'm sitting there with my book and I'm really going through it, and I might be looking some things up or even keeping a little notepad and just noting some things for later. After about a page of that, or maybe 2 pages of it, I get tired. I hope you found this video informative. I know it was a little dry, a little boring. And you know what? If you like this type of breakdowns where we just take a page out of a book like this that's more advanced and really break down the grammar, let me know. I mean, I can do these from time to time. If it was just too painful, let me know that too, and well, we'll just never do another one. So, well, thank you very much for being members of the Curu Spanish crew. And if you really like it, be sure to tell your friends, get them in here. We'll try to see if our community can grow a bit more. And well, I think that's it. I'm going to get back to actually reading this at a normal pace, okay? So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and until next time, hasta luego.